Good day, everyone. Today we are going to be doing a brief introduction of two food safety management systems. Um, Before we go any further, we just need to differentiate a Hasip system from a food safety management system. What is the difference? The most fundamental difference is that when you are looking at the Hasip system, you are looking at hazard identification and control of hazards to ensure the production of a safe food. Whereas in a food safety management system, it considers the entire value chain and not just the product. In other words, it's a systematic approach to ensure that each process in the food chain can contribute to the production of a safe food. You look at how you manage your suppliers, for an example, how you manage your raw material suppliers, how you manage your services, for an example, the people that supply you with cleaning chemicals, the people that supply you with pest control services, your waste control, etc. So it looks at how does each party, interested party, play their role to ensuring the production of a safe food. It does not only consider the product, but we'll explain that further in the next slide. Assuming that you're a small facility, you want to start a pie bakery, there are certain things that you'll need to comply with. So we'll use that example as a perfect example on how to implement food safety management systems. The first thing that any person in South Africa that handles food that they need to comply with is the regulation and relevant legislation, depending on the sector that they belong to. If you are in a food handling business that handles processed food, the first thing that you need to comply with is the regulation R628/2018, which looks at food premises. Basically, it looks at, are your food premises compliant, and are they going to ensure that the food that is produced is safe at all times? In addition to that, it looks at pest control, it looks at waste control, it looks at temperature control, it looks at even personal hygiene in your facility. The most fundamental requirement of this regulation is that the person who's in charge of the food premises is trained. That means that they have gone and received accredited food safety training. In addition to that, their staff must also be trained, and the records of that training must be available to the inspector to inspect. So if you have fulfilled all those requirements, you can then go and approach your local authority. That will be your municipality that will come and inspect. They will send an inspector who will then come and inspect your facility. And once you have been found compliant, they then issue you with a COA, a certificate of acceptability, meaning that your facilities have been found acceptable and they are indeed compliant and will not contribute to the production of an unsafe food. So there is no safety hazard that is posed by your facility. So that's what the inspector would be looking for. Obviously, once you're issued, then legally you can trade. It is important to note that a certificate of acceptability is issued for each food premise. In other words, if you have got two facilities, each facility, if they're not in the same area, will have its own certificate of acceptability, and your name, including your ID, will be imprinted on that certificate of acceptability. So once you've complied with that, then you can move to step number 2. That means that you can apply more good manufacturing practices over and above what is recommended by the regulation. The regulation will cover things, or does cover pest control, does cover waste control, etc. But you may decide perhaps to implement other GMP or good manufacturing practices, such as maintenance, such as cleaning and sanitizing using SAPS accredited chemicals, etc. So that is in addition to what the regulation requires. And the standards that cover GMPs in details is the South African National Standards 10049, as well as another GMP standard, ISO 22002 Part 1, or you could use any other GMP standard or good manufacturing practice standard to implement additional GMPs. So basically, good manufacturing practices are the practices that you'll implement in your facility that will contribute to the production of a safe food. Once you've implemented the GMPs, you can then go further and implement a Hasip system. Remember, in the previous slide, we mentioned the Hasip system. It is important here to mention that you cannot go and implement a Hasip system without implementing these two, step number one and step number two. Firstly, because regulations and relevant legislation is compulsory, it is a legal requirement. And secondly, it does not go far enough in covering all the GMPs. So you have to ensure that you implement additional GMPs to ensure that you are appropriately covered. The standard that we are currently using in South Africa for Hasip is South African National Standards 10330/2020. It was published this year around March. It allows you to trade within the country in South Africa, and many of the SADC countries also accept it. The most important thing to realize here is that it's not an international standard, rather, it's a South African national standard. So this will be organizations that sell to retailers that will implement it, or medium businesses. If you're a small business just doing a small trading, you are trading by the corner in a small shop selling to your local municipality or citizens, you'll be better off just implementing step 1 and 2. But if your customer requires that you implement Hasip certification, then you may be very well compelled to. Also, if you're in the meat processing industry, because of the new regulation that compels those organizations to have accredited Hasip system, then you'll have to implement it. The key important thing here is that it is a national standard, South African standard, and it's not an international standard. Then you can decide to go a step higher and implement an international management system standard. So here, that's where the key management comes into place, the keyword management comes into place. And the standard that is currently being used at the moment is ISO 22000:2018. So it covers the context of our organization. It looks at the interested parties. It looks at leadership responsibility. It looks at traceability. It looks at emergency preparedness in case there's an emergency, internal audits, etc. And all these are not covered by the standards, by the Hasip certification standard, because it mainly, the Hasip is designed to prevent contamination of the food. Although the auditors, when they're auditing, they look at those aspects, but fundamentally, Hasip is about protecting your food from contamination. Another thing that I've mentioned here is that it is not GFSI recognized, meaning that it's not an internationally recognized certification standard. Although the standard itself is international, but according to the GFSI, it is not recognized as a certification standard internationally. Why is that? Is because it has certain shortcomings that have been nicely addressed by the following standard, which is FSSC 22000. And if you look at step 5, or at that stage, that's where we are talking about internationally recognized standards. So those are recognized by the Global Food Safety Initiative, meaning that they have been benchmarked, and they are in fact the same in terms of requirements, meaning that if you have got one, it should be easy for you to switch to the other. So this is more suitable for organizations that are exporting, organizations that are big and that want international recognition. British Retail Consortium is more popular in Europe, and it is mostly used by people that are exporting to Europe. And then FSSC 22000 International is popular worldwide, no matter where you are exporting to. So let's recap again the differences. This one, step 5, on stage 5, BRC FSSC 22000 is GFSI recognized, meaning that all over the world, if you have got this standard, you'll be seen as complying with the highest standard requirements. Step number 4, ISO 22000 2018 is recognized as a standard internationally, but not as a certification standard. In other words, the GFSI does not recognize all the requirements of ISO 22000 as meeting the requirements of the other standards. The interesting part here that you need to bear in mind is that FSSC 22000 incorporates ISO 22000 as well as the ISO 22002 Part 1 on step number 2, because it combined, if both of them combined, they therefore meet the requirements of the GFSI, but individually they do not. Step 3 is a Hasip certification based on a South African standard. You would need to implement it if you're in the meat processing facility as per the new regulations, or if you need recognition as a Hasip certified site. But as a small facility, you don't necessarily need Hasip certification unless your customer requires you to. Good manufacturing practices, it's something that everyone should implement. So step 1 and 2, even for small companies, they should strive to ensure that they fully implement step 1 and 2. And then if for certification on step 3 upwards, it's entirely up to the organization or the customer requirements for you to, if they want you to go for it. What is a GFSI? In the previous slide, I kept on talking about the GFSI. Basically, the acronym stands for Global Food Safety Initiative. They work in benchmarking and harmonization to ensure that all the standards that are recognized internationally have got the same requirements and also the audit criteria. So if you have got BRC and FSSC, basically you should be able to switch to the other without any problem, because both of them are using the GFSI as a benchmarking scheme. And for you, or for the standard to be recognized internationally, it will need to be approved by the GFSI. It does other things. They also assist with capacity building, making sure that those companies that do not meet the requirements of international food safety standards are capacitated to eventually reach the top. It also has public and private partnerships, meaning that it creates or it communicates on regular basis or consults with regulators, with governments, with the private sector, to ensure that all the aspects of food safety are properly included in the standards. So it ensures that information is up to date and keep that line of communication between the interested parties. It's also a platform for the food community to communicate and share ideas. Now let's look at the different food safety management systems and which ones are applicable to which country, for an example. We have got FSSC 22000. Currently, we're on version 5 of FSSC. It is implemented by all sectors in the food manufacturing sector. That will include storage, catering, storage and distribution. Even in the pet food industry, you can implement FSSC 22000. It's popular across the board. Compared to BRC, which is a popular standard for the UK. If you are exporting to the UK, you'd mostly implement the British Retail Consortium standard, and it's based on issue 8 at this point. We also have got BRC catering, BRC packaging, BRC storage and distribution, BRC agents and brokers, but more on that on another course. But if you're a small facility, food production facility, again, you do not need to go to this extent in terms of implementing or requiring certification. Although it is always a good practice to implement your systems as based on these standards, because it can take you can in the near future, depending on your growth trajectory, decide to then go for these certifications. Then we have got Global Gap. Global Gap is implemented by producers or growers. It looks at the farm, the primary producers. So it is a Hasip system for primary producers. Then we've got different standards depending on which country We've got an Australian standard SQF, we have got IFS, which is mostly American, we have got the Canada GAP, we have got a GRMS, which looks into the meat industry. And then we have got the global aquaculture that looks also in terms of the fisheries. So it all depends on what is it that you want to achieve, where you want to export, and which industry or the type of product in terms of the category where you belong. Then you can then decide which standard is best suitable for you. So which food safety system do you need? As I've said before, it depends on the product, it depends on the size of your facility, it depends also on your customer requirements, as well as whether you are selling to a retailer, to a small customer base, or whether we are exporting. If you're exporting, you will normally go for the international standards. If you're just a corner shop selling food to local people, or a restaurant or a guest house, you'll go as far as step number 2 and implement good manufacturing practices. If you're selling to retailers, most likely you will then have to implement Hasip. And if it is a retailer that requires international standards, then you'd go and implement the international standards on step 5. On which food safety system is this cost-based? It is based on the new regulation R628, that covers basic food safety requirements and a brief overview of good manufacturing practices. And we do, of course, cover HACCP principles. In addition to that, we have made sure that we cover also the labeling requirements, so that you know exactly how to label your food, what things to say, and what is it that you must include in terms of labeling your products. Thank you so much, ladies and gentlemen. We have reached the end of our presentation. If you have got any questions, you can click on Q&A session and you can send me any question that you want to ask. Thank you so much. Enjoy the rest of the course.